I hope we can continue the momentum that you both presented. And I invite you both to chime in, ask each other questions, and present more questions as we all continue our collective inquiry today. We just heard your two presentations, Pierre speaking to these three concepts of meaning and value of beads in 18th century Venice, thinking about beads as a symbol of raw economic value, beads as a means of connection with markets and trade, and beads as valuable objects produced in these organizations and systems as a result of these relationships, power relationships, labor relationships, and local dynamics. Mabel, you spoke to the uneven colonial movements of material objects, ideas, and people, specifically and very elegantly in terms of mahogany and freedom, slaves and democracy, shoes and property. So while your research is quite different, Mabel, you already noted there are threads of connection. I'm already seeing a lot in terms of your research methods, perhaps. But I want to pose to both of you, where do you see these points of intersection in your work? And maybe you can explore those a little bit, and maybe also explain where your work diverges.
Okay, I can start. I took a lot of notes, so I hope to orient my reflections upon this. I was struck and impressed by, you talk about methodology, and I was impressed by the use of the sources that Mabel made. She was able to put together primary sources, documentary sources from archives, objects, images of objects, mahogany table, etc., and also paintings and representation of buildings. And I was really impressed that, from my point of view, that's an example of how history nowadays had to integrate different kind of sources, different kind of expertise also. We saw during these days different sensitiveness, perspectives that can enrich our comprehension of the past, and that passed through use of different sources. And we do not forget the richness of our archives that permit to reconstruct the past. And I share this sensitiveness, if you want, of basing resources on primary documental sources. I noted a lot of similarities and a little small differences. I mean, perspectives is different. Questions perhaps are different. Geography is different. Mabel work on the United States, on the Americas. I work on Venice, the Mediterranean. But at the same time, what bring us together is, the ocean. It's the Atlantic world, or worlds, that connected a city hidden in the Mediterranean, in the very heart of the Mediterranean, in the Adriatic Sea, with the 13 colonies and all the Americas. And it was through an ocean and through power relationship, economic relationship, social relationship, that world created, that these two places were connected. But this ocean, this system, the implications of this system, of this ocean, were probably deeper than most people think. This connection, we can look at this connection from the perspective of, oh wow, that was incredible, exotic product were exchanged, economic growth was established, was fueled by these interconnections. But at the very foundations of the system, there was pain, there was suffering, so there was exploitation of people on one side and on the other side of the Atlantic. I do not want to compare the pain or the exploitation of one side with the other, because it is not comparable. It was different system, different type of exploitation. But I mean, exploitation, economic, physical exploitation was one of the element, the fundamental element of this system that connected Venice and the Atlantic. Sorry, I'm adding things, but also the fact that mahogany table, beads, objects in general, buildings, materials, hide deeper meaning. I mean, yesterday we talked about these beautiful objects, the beauty of this object of beads, the beauty of the installation of Kapwani, and the beauty of gold, for example, the beauty of materials that in reality get impress us. But behind this beauty, there was, as I said, also exploitation. There was, the work of thousands of people. And I think that, for example, visitors had to take into account this type of connection, this type of link between objects, the past, and the process that made that object and the implication of that object. For now, I stop here, but I'm very looking forward to hear what Mabel think about this thing.
Yeah, no, I sort of agree with that last point about objects having stories to tell. Absolutely. And I think that's the brilliance of Trinket, is that it just holds this incredibly sort of deep and difficult history. One of the things I love, one of the people I love is Michel Roth-Triot, who's very well-known anthropologist who wrote a book called Silencing the Past. And when he talks about the production of history in the West, he says, there is what happened and there is what is said to have happened, right? And so that history is telling us like part of the story. There's parts of it that are absent, that are left out, right? And that archives are really building the evidence or producing the evidence in order for a certain narrative to be told, right? And that's part of why I was kind of interested in this contrast between, I was like, well, Thomas Jefferson, like this man left evidence of everything. Like if you want to know what he ate on one day of the week, somebody has made a note, including himself, because he knew the importance of leaving the evidence and that he had the power to build an archive of his life. And I wanted to show those three paintings of Corcoran, of Jefferson, Lawrence, and Corcoran, because they sit in major collections, right? So we know who they are. And Henry Lawrence has like 11-volume archive of his letters, and these men left incredible. And then when you want to find out about Phyllis Wheatley, I think there are like 120 letters of Phyllis Wheatley. Like we know nothing. And yet she was widely read in that period. And I thought the poignant thing was this desk that they think was hers. They're not positive, but they think was hers. And I just thought it was incredible that it was made out of that same material of mahogany. And how do these small objects, as you suggest, beads, leave these sort of poignant traces that we can then start to read through. But I can tell you they make those traces very hard to find, because that invoice that I showed you was buried not in the main record group in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where it should have been. It was in a completely different record group because it showed who profited from renting out their enslaved people, right? And I think in the beginning of the 20th century, somebody took all those invoices and moved them to a separate file so that they would be purposefully hard to find. And so that's what I mean. They didn't want that to be said, right? Because, Thomas Corcoran's son, that first art collection, benefited from selling shoes to enslaved people. And that's not what people want to know or want their legacy to be, because history is power.
Thank you. I think, these invisible histories, thinking about the invisible labor behind these structures, the technical skills, the specialized knowledge that maybe, wasn't acknowledged at the time that you're both digging for, associated with craft and trade goods and the built environment. How has that labor persisted to be hidden, and has that changed at all? Like, have we learned how? I mean, from my vantage point, this is showing us why representation is so important in the work that we're doing now, in the work that Kapwani is doing. But maybe you both can speak to these hidden histories and how it may have changed and what we can learn from these things.
Good question. I mean, I'm not sure. I think part of the reason I was interested, because I do not work on 18th century history. I had to learn how to work on 18th century. I had to learn a lot, like how do you read, literally the letters, the language. Part of the project is also on indigenous dispossession. So I'm looking at how enslaved people built American civic monuments dedicated to freedom and liberty and equality, but also on land taken from indigenous people. Right. So how is American whiteness and freedom imagined, right, by these acts of dispossession and devastation? And yet there's this incredible myth of these founding fathers that endures, and these are the things to aspire for. But I think there is something sort of foul and problematic at the heart of that project. And unless we can address that, then we could perhaps aspire to those noble languages written in the Declaration and the Constitution. But there is something, I think, profoundly problematic, that this modern world was created on the backs of all of these places that were dominated by people. That's how the wealth was accrued. And that was a global project, actually. And I think there needs to be an accounting of that. And I like to say these are positions of power. It's not that one is white, it's that one takes a position of whiteness, and those are different things. It's not that one is a man and a patriarch, when a woman can take a position of patriarchy. It's about a power relation. And I think until we undo those power relations, we're going to have to undo those power relations, because we won't survive as a species. We're extracting too much, and it's making our habitat as humans inhabitable.
Yeah, thank you, Mabel, for your suggestions. I think that from the Venetian perspective, glass sector is an interesting case study in which we can see the transformation of work relationship during the early modern period, and in reality from the medieval times to the very contemporary age. Venice was an industrial city until some decades ago. So this dimension that today is not perceived from the tourist, from the visitor. Venice was a really manufacturing city, and it's impressive. It's impressive to note how international trade, the development, for example, of the Atlantic trade, had a direct impact on work organization here in Venice. Glass. There's myths and legends about glass foundation, the foundation and the starting of glass production here in Venice. But during the Middle Ages, glass production organized in this guild institutional framework, and we have to take into account the narrative also of the guilds as spaces of egalitarian relationship between masters and merchants, for example. In the context of early modern economic philosophy, etc., but still, even if we take into account this type of image of guilds, we see a real transformation of work organization between the Middle Ages and the 18th century, that continued also in the 19th century and the 20th century, even if industrialization came in the glass sector here in Venice. And so it's fascinating how this global demand of beads, for example, and the trade that was organized around the slave trade had a direct impact on local social structures, because in the course of time, artisans and craftsmen became, I would not say But they experimented a sort of proletarization process. So they became workers without protection, even if they were masters inside the guilds. And then you have all the side of women workforce and the introduction of hundreds of women, also immigrants, sure, from Friuli, from Venetian mainlands, that collaborate in that was exploited and collaborate in this production. So we can see the real impact of the modern system of production here in Venice, and how this was based on on exploitation of workforce and on inegalities and on relationship between merchants who became entrepreneurs, international entrepreneurs that were able to establish a direct link with slave traders in Lisbon, in Liverpool, and popular workforce here in Venice. So yeah, I think that this system had an impact and transformed also work and social relationship in the long run. So for centuries, from the 17th to the 19th centuries, we see this more or less the same form of exploitation of relationship between employers and workers here in Venice from this perspective of class beats. So there's a continuity, this system, even if technical skills or, I don't know, material objects changed, even if industrialization in the end, even if glass production also was integrated in a more industrialized system. Imperialesse were there in the 17th century as well as in the first half of the 20th century. They were exploited workforce in the 17th as well as in the 20th century, in a context of institutional guild framework as well as in industrial system production. So there was certainly continuity this time of relationship.
So thank you. I think it's really clear in this conversation the nuance and complexity of this work that you're both uncovering. I know that throughout the symposium, and a lot of times these binaries are presented, the known, the unknown. Even things came up in yesterday, the spirit world, the human world, the permanent, the impermanent, the natural, the artificial, free and forced. So we know these binaries exist, but we also know there's plenty of nuance and complexity. So maybe you both can speak a little bit to that complexity in your research, how you might push against binaries and simplifications that exist.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, history deals with complexity. I mean, writing an article or making a research and even talking about these small objects imply taking into account complexities, so social structures, economic structures, power dynamics, etc., etc. And yeah, I don't know if we are able to transmit to reproduce the complexity of this past that no more exists, and we can do this through documentary sources, for example. But yeah, for me, the real point is that since that just some decades ago, for example, small objects like beads and objects in general were not considered as themes, as issues in historiography and even slavery. The approaches towards slavery and the Atlantic slave trade changed over time. So questions changed. And the important conclusion that material culture studies obtain with this attention to objects is to, from my perspective, is try to transmit the fact that objects, materials are not neutral entities, and they are hidden. They hide dynamics, stories, as Mabel told previously. And so we have, even if we think about history, about a discipline with important consequences on societies. So if we think about it as a dissemination process also, we have to transmit the importance of this complexity, the importance of this hidden structure inside objects. And for example, I'm taking always Venice as an example, but it is important to communicate to visitors, hundreds of thousands of visitors that every year come here, that behind these objects, behind these churches, behind Conteria, for example, behind Basilica di San Marco, there were not only stories, but the process of history. Things are there, buildings are there, because in the past they were made, they were manufactured, they were fabricated, or they were brought here. So the complexity is also the complexity of transmit to society different images of objects, of structures that are around us. And that's I think that's one of the first objective of history, despite its scientific objectives of reconstruct the past.
So it's the storytelling around the objects and the structures as well.
It's a social mission.
Yeah, I was curious, who made that sketch of the woman who was beating? It went from...
Was Giovanni Grammebrook was a painter. I do not know a lot about him, but he made a lot of representation. You can find his work at Correra Museum here in Venice, for example. He made a lot of aquarelli of Venetian workers. He painted a lot of Venetian workers or Venetian costumes of the 18th century. So there's a list. There's in reality a lot of images of glassmakers, men and women working, etc., etc. And so also this image communicates something. The idea behind the painting, the social structure that it conveys, also a bucolic image of a work that was really hard in reality and that causes also physical pain. So it's as always non-neutral representation, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was interesting in comparison to the Canaletto, which circulated widely, and but that this is this kind of moment, almost ethnographic, in a way, right? Observing what was there and then sort of capturing. So we see, there's so many ways in which this dress, who was she? What does it say about her class? Where what she is wearing may have come from. And I feel like these are the things that can tell us a lot about how everyday life unfolded, right? In ways that, yes, there's stuff in the Canaletto, but who knows what's producing out of an atelier all those paintings, right? And I find this one really fascinating.
And also in comparison with the photo that was projected yesterday of Imperialesse in Venetian Calli in the 19th or 20th century, and we saw in this comparison the continuity also of this work and also of the exploitation that I mentioned before. That was so. Even if capitalism and industrialization accelerated the process, a phenomenon, there was something that never changed, and this, in this case, was women exploitation.
Mabel, I want to ask you a question. I I appreciate your presentation of your research specifically in this context, but I know more broadly in terms of your curatorial practice, your presentation of your own artwork and design work, you may do this similar amount of research as you present. Not in a dissimilar way that Kapwani has pulled together all of this research for Trinket as well. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that process and that practice that you also hold.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I say I'm undisciplined, just because, yeah, I have professional attention deficit disorder. So I do many things. But part of it is to try to explore these histories that aren't there. You know, comes from a family. I had no idea what my family history, because nobody told us and nobody wanted to share what that was. So to try to dig and understand your connection to a pastness, you know, in relation to the histories, let's say, that you're given in university, it was really important for me. And so in order to do that work, you know, I still work as a designer. I sometimes work as an artist, a curator, and, you know, a number of things. And so it's been important to find other mediums through which to explore ideas. So I went to the University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson. That's my Jefferson obsession. But I had the privilege of working on a team that designed a memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA. Part of that work was to work in an archive, the university archive of slavery, and you realize nothing's in that archive of these people who built, in 4,000 plus people who built and lived at the very little, you know. And there's one image of an enslaved woman, Isabella Gibbons, and we have her remembrance of slavery. And she was trying to correct the South's rewriting of that history by saying, no, this is what we remember. And this was only 2 years after emancipation. We remember the collars, the beatings, the dogs chasing us, the theft of our children from the... Like, she was like, we remember the violence and we're not going to forget it. No matter what you try to say, we loved our masters and so on. But that's it, out of 4,000 plus people. So what do you do when you're making a memorial that requires names and dates and images, like Thomas Jefferson, who's everywhere, right? You know, who's left traces everywhere. So you have to start to be inventive and creative around that. And that's some of the things that we did at the memorial, which was to do a kind of provisional mark making. And then last year at the Architecture Biennale, we did, my collaborators and I, we did a sound video piece about the archive saying, okay, so suppose if it's not in stone, could we do it in image and sound to say that maybe not being known in the archive is a space of freedom? And so the sound, we use sound and light to explore that. And so, you know, that helped me start to think about form and meaning that I now take back into my research. So I think there's and I think it's funny, but there's a cycle through which you're researching and doing archival work, but you're also questioning these institutions and what you're finding and what it means. And I think there's always that aha moment. When I saw that Corcoran invoice, I was like, wait a minute, that can't be. And he's selling shoes. And it really helped me understand, even in that invoice, how there is this repetition of devaluation of Harry. Harry, his name is Negro Harry. His last name is property of, again and again and again. And so it helped me. That's how that's the violence that you keep someone enslaved. So finding those aha moments are really, really, I think, important in the work. And I think I'm just going to jump on your neck, right? You had something very similar in like why you started doing all this work on beads, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I anticipate the answer, but yeah, I can start with a lot of conversations and answers yesterday started with a story, and I can start with a personal story. I mean, I've never, as far as I know, I was always interested in history, but I've never been interested in Venetian history, as far as I remember. During my undergraduate studies, I was obsessed with Byzantine history, for example. So I made a license thesis on the fall of Constantinople and again. And then during my master degree, I came across for an exam, I came across a book on 18th century Venice, and I read a sentence about glass beads and how glass beads were important for the Republic in the 18th century, and that was the lightning strike for me. I mean, I read about these 5 million ducats generated by this industry and trade, and I said, wow, how was that possible? How that enormous monetary value was generated from these things, so that at that time I was not aware of the war behind beads, and so from there I found a blind spot in historiography, and I started to research, and I started my thesis, my research from there, and from there was a building. It was like a building that was built around these little sentence that struck me the first time. So it was bizarre. It was a casual encounter with these objects that revealed me a world. So that's also the interesting ways in which we can encounter our themes, our issues, our questions. I've never thought about beads before that sentence, and now I work on them every day, and so I'm happy to have read that sentence.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's so interesting thinking about how both of your work is investigating these archives and these histories and the research, but then Mabel, you just mentioned too, being outside of the archive is also kind of an act of resistance in a way, which I think was just sparked something in me. I do want to make sure we have some time for questions from the group as well. So I think Anais has a microphone if you'd like to ask something. Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much for both of your presentations. I think I'm kind of interested in this question of archive and critical fabulation. I think that, or obviously, both of your work kind of relies on going back into the archive to try and build, a narrative of global trade at this time, but particularly when it comes to the institution of transatlantic slavery and the lives of enslaved people, there are a lot of historical, lacunae that kind of exist that we have to fill in some one way or the other. So I guess this question kind of has two parts. The first being material culture is very important for understanding this point in history. How do we even do this? How do we incorporate material culture and, objects of this time into the archive effectively? What does an archive look like beyond, just written documents, etc.? My second question, or the second part of the question, is kind of how, or to what extent, this idea of critical fabulation is useful in telling these stories, and to what extent, does this idea fall short?
I'll ask that. For those who may not know, critical fabulation is a concept put forward by a colleague, Saidiya Hartman, who I spoke of, who is suggesting, particularly when something is not in an archive, means what is your evidence and how do you write history? So there's a question of how does one begin to imagine what might have happened? So there's what happened, what is said to have happened, and then there's the speculate, what may have happened, right? And it can be, I think the what may have happened can be quite useful when the absence of evidence is there, so that you it becomes speculative, but could become one possible narrative, because all histories are literally pieced together. It's what is said to have happened. It's not everything that has happened in that moment. So I think it can be very helpful. I mean, the part, that I spoke about on Lawrence, and then on the part on the shoes, the way I approached that chapter, which was a very difficult chapter, because I knew there was going to be no evidence of enslaved people who built, it's 2/3 of the workforce who built the U.S. Capitol was enslaved, but the evidence is just completely absent. I mean, it's just gone. And so you have to start to imagine what that is. And it took a long time to find it. But curiously enough, I found, very, very similar to what Pierre Niccolò showed, I found a watercolor by a French aristocratic immigrant from 1817 that showed a street scene of Washington, D.C. Happened to show a number of buildings that I wanted to see. There were people on the street. I mean, it was a very almost ethnographic portrayal, and it became for me a way into that document. But it's difficult. This was the challenge at the memorial. We heard from the Black community in Charlottesville, name names. But there were no names in the archive, right? Because that's what we want, figures. Well, we don't know who people were. And so how do you do that? And we had to come up with provisional ways of every 4,000 person just has a mark, a gash, right? There are many first names. And then for the records in the archive that might have said this is at Charlottesville at UVA, 3 Negro hands at Christmas, we used kinship relations and occupations to fill. So you will see mother, a brickmaker, there's one fiddler on the entire wall of the memorial. So it started to create a kind of genealogical cloud, and we changed the form rather than vertical rows of names, which simply replicates the ledger. We made a kind of genealogical cloud of first names, first and last names, how few they were, and then kinship and occupations to change how this gets read. And it's been very effective. So I think challenging, the assumptions, the presumptions of what an archive should give you forces you to be creative, right? And I think that's something that Trinket is actually asking us to think through, its complexity.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that, this question is very useful for shed some lights maybe on historical methodology and different type of historical methodology, because my own perspective is a very Italian and French approach to history, on how we build history, on how we reconstruct and interpret history. I mean, personally, I am guided by questions and problématiques and narrative also, but not really narrative. But at the very heart of my work, there are primary sources. So it's from primary sources that I can build my work, from documental primary sources. And all my interpretations and all the narrative I can build is funded on them, is built on them. It's a personal point of view. It's as I said, it's a very Italian, it's traditional, and French also, and continental methodology. But from my perspective, history is built around primary sources. So the archives, what we found there, it's the very heart of our work. We can make questions to sources, we can elaborate them and integrate them in a broader picture. But at the very heart, there are sources, not the narrative, from my point of view. So it's challenging. Changing narrative is challenging. Adopt new perspective. We have to consider them. But from my point of view, it's the source, the core of my work. And this is this do not mean that we shall not take into account and consider different perspective, and the evolution of historiography, and the obvious evolution of questions that we pose, and the evolution of our sensitiveness towards problems, issues, and social issues and problems also. But what I'm saying, my perspective on history, on how we of this job, of this work, is an artisanal work of patching together pieces that arrive from the past. And for the second part of the question, the material culture, the capacity to take into account, to consider material culture inside our studies. Sometimes, that's anecdotal, but sometimes, for example, in Venetian archives, we found inside letters, inside boxes, we found little pieces of textiles, for example. So the real material object that came from the 18th century, we see in similar documents of catalogs or bead books, so commercial letters that include little stripes of silk textile, silk fabric that was sent to correspondents on partners on other places to see to in order to show them how we can make them and how we can sell them, etc. So there's, if you want a fascinating side of finding these materials, this object inside the archive. But the other issue is to collaborate with different with different people. I mean, I'm not. I make a practical example. I write and I study a lot. I study beads and I write a lot about them, but I have not the skills nor the knowledge of practical, for example, decorations, of a knowledge of different type of beads, and for that I have to rely on the knowledge of other people. For example, collectors who maybe have not the same knowledge of past, of history, of social structure, etc., like me, but we can integrate our different knowledge, our different skills together, and so that's another point in favor for this type of events. I mean, history today has to be built around different fields and different knowledge coming from different people. So I integrate material culture through the knowledge of and the help of other people, other scientists or other type of people.
Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you. Unfortunately, I think we do have to wrap up, but I want to thank you both, Mabel O. Wilson and Pierre Niccolò Sofia, for your insight, for your knowledge sharing, your generosity in this moment. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.